Hi everyone, my name is Mary Beth Lima. I am a professor in bio and ag engineering at Louisiana State University. I am a PE in ag engineering, and today I'm going to talk about a little bit about exam prep. I took the ag eng exam actually twice. I did not pass it the first time, so I have some ideas on that, especially for those of you out there who maybe are not first-time test takers. If you are, that's great too. But I'm talking about a couple of things, engineering economics and statistics, which, while not a huge part of the exam in terms of direct questions, maybe you'll get 3 or 4 throughout through the exam. They tend to crop up kind of throughout, just in terms of general knowledge and things that you need to know, no matter what kind of problem you're working on in the exam. So just a brief overview of what we're going to cover in about the next hour and a half or so. I'm going to do a little bit on exam prep, and then just a statistics review and an economic analysis review. So I'd encourage y'all to get your references and your calculators ready. And we'll be having some pauses throughout so you can kind of work some of the problems. I don't have every answer today, so there's also going to be another file where you've got a solution set. And this used to be a live webinar where folks could kind of queue in and ask questions, but because this is now a recording, y'all are welcome to email me questions, and my email address is on the first slide, mlima1@lsu.edu, and I welcome questions. So with that, in terms of the first thing I'm going to talk about today is PE exam prep. So I think the key to this exam is going to be your references. You can be asked pretty much anything, and the ag eng exam is so broad with so many of the different topics that it is impossible to be an expert at every single area, and you don't need to be to pass the exam. So I can tell y'all, I was trained as a food and bioprocess engineer, and I was having to answer questions on, biomechanical engineering, soil and water engineering, structures and environment, that sort of thing. So again, the exam is really designed so that with basic engineering knowledge, you should be able to solve about 60% of the problems, no matter what the area is. But a huge piece of that is having the right references. And again, because I took this exam, it was a new format with all the different kinds of ag eng problems. I think my experience is still mapped pretty well for y'all. But the references themselves, to an extent, may have shifted over time. So I strongly encourage y'all to consult the ASABE webpage, which has an up-to-date list of references, and really take a look at those. You want to include references that have a whole bunch of information, and then those major subject areas that are going to be covered on the exam. You want to have like sort of the Bible, if you will, of that particular area of ag eng. So again, we're going to talk about references, a little bit about time in terms of preparing for the exam and then taking the exam, and then some strategies to help you prepare. So again, references are super critical. Hopefully this URL still works. If it does not, again, just go to ASABE and call about it. They've got a really active part of the organization, PEI, the Professional Engineers Institute, has this updated information. And it's definitely true that some references are more useful than others. And so for me, the reference that I used a lot in preparing was a guide to professional licensure for agricultural, food, and biological systems engineers. This is out of print at this point, and again, I think it's out of date, but the point here would be that if there's anything similar that ASABE has put out for test takers, make sure you get it. You can bring in any sort of material that you want as long as it's bound. And for me, like I said, the first time I took this exam, I took it in 2000 and I did not pass it. I just didn't study enough. Felt like I got all the food and bioprocess problems, but just didn't have enough expert knowledge, I think, in some of the other areas to quite pass. And so I was actually a student the first time that this online review course was taught. And I took all the notes from all the speakers and all the problems that they did for us and things that they suggested that we do, and I put them in a bound notebook. And that was, I didn't use it a ton during the exam, but it was just helpful to have it all there, because that sort of was the story of how I prepared for it, and some of the notes that I had there were helpful in the actual exam that I took in 2005. You definitely need a copy of ASABE standards. So again, I used the 2000 edition for the 2005 exam, and I was fine. But you want to make sure that your standards book is, within the last 5 years, because standards are updated. And I do remember the problems were pretty updated, and I think I missed one problem, perhaps because I didn't quite have the updated reference. I can't strongly suggest enough that you use one or both of these. Charles Lindbergh does a whole bunch of really awesome, Michael Lindbergh does a bunch of awesome publications on professional engineers exams for different engineering disciplines. Unfortunately, there's not one for the ag engineering exam because there's not enough of us to warrant putting such a book together. But the civil engineering reference manual for the PE exam and the mechanical engineering reference manual for the PE exam, I actually brought both of those references into the test, and they were immensely helpful. I really use these most of the time. The nice thing about the civil engineering manual is you've got a lot of overlap in the ag engineering in the areas of soil and water, wastewater, pumps. We're going to talk about economics in a little bit. There's a lot of econ tables in there to facilitate easy problem solving in those areas. And there's an index. So if you see a term you're not familiar with and you look it up in the index, chances are you're going to find it in a big comprehensive reference manual like this. Same with mechanical engineering. So it was really useful for HVAC, so some of your structures and environment problems, machine systems, there's some on fans. So I actually brought both and used both, but you don't have to bring both. Just, bring one or the other. If you had to pick one, I picked the civil one. Other references that I used during the exam were the wastewater engineering book. This has since been a 4th edition. Henderson, Perry, and Young, the Principles of Process Engineering. I used that for several problems. You need some sort of wood engineering book for the tables, the wood property tables at the back. So make sure you get some sort of book for that. I did use a soil physics book, not much, maybe for one problem. The Midwestern Plan Service, there's an out-of-print publication, but it's MWPS-1, and it's the Structures and Environment Handbook, which I actually found useful, even though it's a little bit old. All of the equations that you would use in Structures and Environment are going to be similar to what you would encounter on the exam. And again, ASABE standards can also help for that. And then I used the Schwab book for soil and water conservation engineering. I also brought a number of references that I didn't use at all. These did come from the list that was suggested by ASABE, but again, they're pretty specific. And so, these ones I didn't use. And it's okay to bring references and not use them as long as you can haul them into the exam room. And you've got them. It's better to have them and not need them than need them and not have them. So just do pay attention to your references. They are a super important part of preparing well for the exam. So in terms of your time, as you practice problems for the PE, you want to get all those reference books that you've got and get used to using them. So if you know, for example, in the ASABE standards book that you suspect you're going to be using particular types of standards that maybe some of the presenters are going to tell you about in areas of coverage for the PE exam, maybe you want to tab those so that you know exactly where they are. I actually had an index that I made of like types of problems that I thought I might encounter and exactly where I would find what I needed to in terms of where to find it in my references, and that was helpful for me. I suggest that you do all the problems that you're given in the online course. You can redo them. You can do problems in your reference books. Charles Lindbergh also does, he sells sample PE exams. Again, not an ag PE, but you can get civil and mechanical engineering PE exams and just use some of those questions that are going to be similar to what you might see in the ag engineering exam. There are sample exam problems on the ASABE website. Again, if this URL is no longer current, just contact ASABE and they can get you the right spot on the website. You are going to have to really focus your time, again, because this exam is very broad. You're not going to be able to be an expert in everything, and that's okay. So common systems knowledge, like the subjects we're going to discuss in a little bit, like statistics, like economics, like sizing a pump, like pressure, force over area, all those kinds of things, those make up the bulk of the questions on the exam. So I would really focus your time on that kind of common systems knowledge. Your expertise area is really important because those are sort of your gimme problems that you're going to be able to do easily and quickly because you're used to working with those. And you want to try to have some sort of secondary knowledge areas. And again, you just want to know enough to be dangerous. You're just trying to solve about 60% of the problems in a particular area, even if it's not your area of expertise. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on what you're not going to touch, and there's likely something that you're not going to touch. So I know for me, I'm not a big machine systems person at all. And I couldn't believe it, but on the PE exam, pressure, force over area actually got me through about 60% of the problems in that area. But I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time and try to get any more complex machinery problems because it's just not my area of expertise, and I didn't feel like it was worth my time investment to try to get those extra couple of problems correct. And you do want to try to, at least a week before the exam, try to sit down and actually simulate a true test using that 8-hour exam format, realizing that I think now the PE has pretty much switched to a 6-hour exam format, which I promise is better than the 8. But you do want to do things like road test checking issues, meaning that if you've got a morning session and you sit down to take the exam and you drink coffee in the morning and you're going to have to go to the bathroom by 10, you might have to, it might take time to get up, get out of the testing environment, come back and kind of get started, and you just want to make sure that you're doing what you need to do so that you concentrate your best and do your best on the exam with the time that's given. So that's, those strategies would be how I prepared time-wise for the test. Once you're in the exam, there's also time management strategies during that exam that you should employ. So the exam is really designed such that each question that you're going to answer takes an average of 6 minutes. Because good or bad, the thing about that is there's a real range of how long it's going to take you to do the problem. So there are going to be quite a few 1-minute problems. It's really just a lookup. Do you know what the area is? Do you know what's being asked for? Do you have the references to find the answer? And do you know how to quickly get the answer? So there are a number of 1-minute problems, but there are also expert-level problems in the different areas of ag engineering that can take 15 to 20 minutes to answer. And so the key is to, not start at question number 1 and go all the way up and get stuck on a 15 or 20-minute problem early on so that you run out of time. So I would suggest that you go through the exam and answer the questions in the following order. The first thing I would do is take a pass-through and do the quick, easy problems that you know that you can do and get right. Then you want to go back through the exam a second time and attempt the problems that you know you can do that maybe take a little bit more time. If you have a question that is completely out of your area and you know it's beyond what you can do quickly, guess. It's okay to guess. I guessed at about 10% of the questions on the exam and I passed with no problem the second time that I took the exam. So you just want to make sure for probability purposes that you guess the same letter every time. So that's not an issue. It's totally good to do. And then you want to go back and take another pass through the exam and then do the ones that you think you can do that take some time. And after the end of that, if there's any time left, you can go back and check your answers, but go to the questions that are bugging you if there are any. So I know I did this, used this this format. I think I had 2 4-hour sessions, and in the morning I actually finished in about 2 hours and 45 minutes, and in the afternoon I finished in 3 hours and 15 minutes. I know especially in the morning there was one problem that I really thought I could get, and it was just bugging me. I couldn't quite figure it out, and I had the time to just sort of go back and hang out with it and play with it, and I eventually I believe I got the correct answer. The answer I got was one of the choices. So I think if you go this route, you will manage your time well in the exam. You just have to be super careful to keep the question number that you're answering matched up with the proper number on the answer sheet. But y'all are engineers, you know how to do that. Not a problem. So, some of the strategies to do well on the Ag Eng exam itself is to develop problem recognition, where you know what kind of problem is being asked, you know, what area it's in, and you know, whether this is a lookup problem, whether this is going to require an equation, whether it's going to require a series of equations, etc. I think to a point you need to develop flexible thinking, especially if you're in areas outside your expertise. Sometimes if you can break down the question, it can be pretty simple, and you may not need the expert knowledge to even solve it. I remember encountering an irrigation problem on the exam, and where it just showed several nozzles and sort of the sphere of push out of some water, and it asked, you know, what percent area coverage is this? And even without having the equation in front of me, there were 4 possible answers, and one was 0 and one was 100% coverage, and you can even see just by looking at it and using a simple trig that it wasn't 0 and it wasn't 100. So you already switched from 4 choices to 2, and you could probably estimate it and get it right, or go and find the equation and solve it from there. So try to think about, you know, how you're going to approach problems, and remember that, you know, you may not need to look it up every time. Again, you can guess with things that you have no idea. Just pick that same letter. That example I just told you was one of them, where many times you can eliminate 2 of the 4 choices easily, and that fundamental knowledge piece is really critical. So, you know, you're probably not going to have to study your expertise area much, but you know, that fundamental knowledge, those things that are cutting across different areas of Ag Eng. If you know how to size a pump for soil and water, you can size a pump in process engineering. So try to really focus on that if you can, and just remember those major PE reference manuals are really helpful in that regard. So you do have to answer about 60% of the problems correctly to pass the exam, and that, again, that common system knowledge is going to really make the difference for you. And again, at least in my experience, when I split up the different expertise areas of Ag Eng, about 60% of the problems were solvable even without expert knowledge in the area, as long as you had those good references and you knew where to look for information. Or again, use flexible thinking to try to get yourself to the answer. And the other 40% of those expertise questions were expert knowledge level. So I totally skipped power and machinery. I skipped irrigation. I remembered a little bit more about structures and environment, but if they were, you know, super big expert problems, I generally just skip those. But there's, in the grand scheme of the whole exam, that's really a small part of the exam, maybe 10% of the exam total. So again, I don't have all the answers to these out, but I will make sure that there's a posting that goes with this so that you can kind of see. In terms of the exam prep, this is just a quick little exercise that we can kind of sort of do here together, where, again, for those easy, quick, 1-minute questions that appear on the exam, you want those to just take you 1 minute to answer. So they do test your basic knowledge of the field, and they're making sure that you've brought the proper references and you know how to use them. So, so you can practice these, and you know, if you take a look at the questions, I'm about to give you 8 of them, and you can just sort of look at them and say, you know, what kind of problem is this? In what references do I think I'm going to find this information? And then, you know, when you actually do find the answer, you might want to record not just the answer, but which reference you used, where you found it, what page it was on, etc. Because you might encounter similar problems on the exam itself, and you can use this bound information as part of your PE notebook to find it. So the first question is, what is the heat of combustion of propane? And I'll give you all about 30 seconds to a minute to look that up. Okay, I'm not sure if y'all had a chance to look it up yet, but essentially heated combustion of propane. If you go to Henderson, Perry, and Young, the process engineering book, it's going to give you heated combustion of some fuels. And so if you sort of take a look at this table, you can see there's high and low values here. So you've actually got two values instead of one for the heated combustion of propane. So it's, again, 46,360 kilojoules per kilogram or 50,150 kilojoules per kilogram. And so I'm partly showing the answer to this because when you get your four choices, this PE is a multiple choice exam, you're not going to have both of those answers be in there where you're like, gosh, which one do I pick? A lot of times you can just average the two, but you're going to have one answer that's in between that range, or it's one end or the other, and so that's how you would choose your answer. So, question 2 is the Atterberg limit test measures what? So those of you who are soil and water people, you might immediately recognize this as a soil and water problem. For those of you who don't study that area, if you had the Civil Engineering PE reference manual, you might make use of the index, and you could look it up and see that it measures soil plasticity. Okay, Young's modulus of elasticity of stainless steel. I'll give you all a few seconds to look that up. All right, don't have the answer to this one handy, but again, if I'm looking, I might be consulting my mechanical engineering prep book for the PE exam, any materials properties book. Question 4, what's the density of air at 10 degrees Celsius? Okay, once again, don't have the answer to this off the top of my head. Again, I will post these, but again, you can actually find this in Henderson, Perry, and Young, properties of air. You potentially could look at any thermodynamics section, too, and try to get that sort of information. Question 5, what is the curve number for contoured row crops in good hydrologic conditions for hydrologic soil group B? You can tell from this problem, I think the way it's worded, it's a soil and water problem. If you're not sure what a curve number is, you can look that up in the index. I know the answer to this question is 85. Civil engineering manual on that. PE manual, any soil and water book is going to have it as well. Question 6, for a relatively uniform distribution of soil particles 1 millimeter in diameter, what is the largest sieve size that these particles would not pass through? Again, don't have the answers off the top of my head, but this is going to appear in any soil and water engineering book. There's going to be tabulated data on the sieve size. I also found it in the civil engineering PE review in. What is the typical concentration of suspended solids in septage? So septage tells you this is a wastewater engineering question. So Metcalf and Eddy has tabulated data on this. And then last question, what is the equilibrium moisture content of rough rice at 30 degrees Celsius and 80% relative humidity? Okay, this is going to be grain drying, and it's actually a straight ASAVE standard. And again, I'll get to all the particulars. I think it's D245, and there's a point something because there's lots of different versions. But again, this is just a tabulated data where you look at the relative humidity and one sec. Actually, for the equilibrium moisture content. So if you have the relative humidity and you just use your isotherms for 30 degrees Celsius, you can read across to get the equilibrium moisture content. So those are those 8 questions, and again, I'll get y'all answers, at least for the references that I use to come up with the answers for those. I think all of you will find that you probably have other references that still have that information. But really, about 10 to 20% of the questions on the exam were like that. And so they're really quick. And if you've got the right references and you know where to find the information, then getting those problems is a snap. So maybe you want to make up problems like this for yourself just to practice. Try to use the different areas if you can. And just know as you start working problems in these areas that sometimes finding information like this can be used in more complicated problems, and I just want to know that you know how to find that initial information. So that sort of ends part 1, which is exam prep. And again, if y'all have any questions on that, please let me know via email. And so now we're going to shift into engineering economic analysis and statistics. And so, again, these are broad areas and can be used in any area of ag engineering. Statistics is really commonly used because you need descriptive data or descriptive information to help interpret data, whether you're a soil and water engineer, a structures and environment engineer, ag mechanical engineer, etc. And then economics just really helps you to make engineering decisions. And so my suggestion for what references to take for these couple of subjects would be to use the civil engineering or mechanical engineering PE reference book. There is a chapter on statistics in each one, as well as a chapter on engineering economic analysis. So my only caveat would be for statistics that there is a Z chart, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that is at the back of the book, but you're also going to need a T chart as well, and those don't come in these reference books. And so you want to make sure you've got a T chart. And then nicely, both of them have full interest tables for engineering economic analysis questions at the back of the book, these reference books. So you don't need any, I don't think you need any references beyond these reference books for the PE, for these 2 areas. So in terms of statistics basics, you've got measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion, which means that anytime we have data, a measure of central tendency is going to tell you what number or what area do these data tend to clump around? Are they centered around something? And measures of dispersion give you a sense of how spread out your data is. So there are several measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion that you might be asked about or you might see commonly in your area of expertise. So the mean is what we commonly refer to as the average, where you take the sum of all the numbers in a data set and divide it by the numbers, the number of data points in that data set. Technically, an average is really only two numbers, where a mean is three or more. So the mean is like the average, but we use that statistical term mean to mean we've got three or more data points in our sample. The median is, you can sort of think of the median as the middle strip of a road. It is the data point that is in the middle of the set. So if you have a set of data points, you arrange them from the lowest value to the highest value. The median is the number in the middle. And that's really easy if there's an odd number of data points in your data set. If there's an even number, then you would take the middle two numbers and average those, and that's your median. And then the mode is the value that occurs most often in your data set. Measures of dispersion, again, are how spread out the data are. So standard deviation is sort of like the average value of how spread out your data are. Your variance is that standard deviation squared. The range is like your highest data point value minus your lowest data point value. So the whole range of data is just the high minus the low. And the coefficient of variation is similar to standard deviation. It's just the standard deviation divided by the mean, sort of like a normalized standard deviation for a given data set. So for the PE, I would just make sure you've got equations to determine the measures of central tendency and the measures of dispersion. Again, they're all given to you and they're pretty straightforward in your reference manuals. And the only thing to remember with these things is that, at least for the measures of dispersion, you're going to have slight differences in the equation depending on if you're working with a population or a sample. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. There's a square root of n factor, where n is the number of points in your data set, where that factor comes into play when you've got a sample. So, if you all remember about statistics, distributions are pretty important. So distributions are used to describe various data sets and can be used to solve engineering problems in relation to those data sets. So we use distributions to sort of to understand data and to manipulate data and to draw conclusions about data. So we have distributions that involve mean, averages, and then we have sampling distributions that involve variance, or measures of dispersion. So a normal distribution is the most common distribution that you're going to encounter as a working engineer, and so that's going to be our focus. There's also a student T distribution, and again, we'll talk about this too in a little bit. You'll also use that for small numbers of data points in a particular sample. So these are really the two that you're going to be using, I would say, for the PE exam. The F distribution and chi-square distribution are distributions that involve variance. And while you might encounter these in research, you typically don't get them much in engineering practice. So I would not encourage you to bring those distributions to the exam because I really don't think that you're going to need them. But I think you really need to be very familiar with the normal distribution. So just as a review, a normal distribution really is just a hump, if you will. It's symmetrical, and what that means is that if you were to draw a line down the center of your distribution, the shape to the left of the distribution is the same as the shape to the right of the distribution. So if you've got a standard normal distribution, it's going to have a mean of mu and a standard deviation of sigma. And if you took the area under that distribution, it represents 100% of the possibilities for a particular scenario. for a normal distribution, the mean of that data set is equal to the median of the data set, which is equal to the mode of the data set. So for perfectly normally distributed data, all the measures of central tendency are the same. And so this, again, if you look at the area under this distribution, and it represents 100% of the possibilities, that line right down the center of the distribution is where it's the value of the mean, which is also equal to the value of the median, which is also equal to the value of the mode. But if you draw a line down the center of that, 50% of the area under your distribution is to the right of the mean, and 50% is to the left of the mean. And so probably the key to these problems is trying to figure out kind of where you are along this distribution. So for the picture I've drawn here, it's just represents the number of nanoparticles on the y-axis graphed against the diameter of your nanoparticles in the x-axis. And so if these data are normally distributed and you have, if you've identified one nanoparticle, its diameter, you would represent it as x. And sort of where you travel along that x-axis is where it's going to dictate the value of that diameter. And so this may not make sense yet, but it will soon, I promise. So an x value is higher than the mean for this normal distribution if you are to the right of the mean, and it's lower than the mean value if you're to the left of the mean. And so, you know, again, that x value is really going to represent where you are in the distribution. And then z is going to be the number of standard deviations away from the mean that you are. So the z value is always going to be positive if you're to the right of the mean, and the z value is going to be negative if you are to the left of the mean. And the only equation you need to know for the normal distribution is the one on the right in the bottom that says that your z value is equal to x, and again, that's sort of wherever you are along that x-axis, minus mu, which is the mean of the distribution, divided by sigma, which is the standard deviation of the distribution. So, you are going to have to know how to read a z-chart to do these kinds of problems in statistics. And again, z is going to tell you how many standard deviations you are away from the mean. So if you take a look at the z-chart, which is pretty typical of z-charts, you're going to see the picture, which is representing a normal distribution. They've got a line right down the center, and there is a 0 down on the x-axis, and that represents the center of the distribution, where the mean equals the median equals the mode. And if you sort of look at the graph, you can see there's a z value, and then it's got a hashed in area between 0 and z, where z in this case is positive because it's to the right of the mean. And what this chart is telling you is it's giving you areas under the distribution that you reach from the center of the distribution to z number of standard deviations away. So if you take a look at all of the tabulated values, the first column says z, and then there's a bunch of columns after that. There's a 0 column, a 1 column, a 2 column, etc. So the first column gives you a value for z in tenths of a standard deviation away from the mean. And all of the rest of the columns you would read across that top row, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those are hundreds of standard deviations away from the mean. So if you want to know the area under a normal distribution, read from the center of the distribution to z is, for example, 0.4 standard deviations away from the mean, you would go start with your z column on the left, and you would go down to the 0.4 value, and then if you go across to the 0 column, you read 0.1554. And what that's telling you is that the area under the distribution, the normal distribution, from the center of the distribution to 0.4 standard deviations away, the area under that distribution is 0.1554, or 15.54% of the entire area under that normal distribution. Okay. Why don't y'all go ahead and see if you can figure out what is the area under the distribution if Z is 0.55 standard deviations away from the mean. Okay, hopefully y'all read 0.2088. So if you're 0.55 standard deviations away from the mean, you're going to start again with your left column, and you're going to go down to the 0.5 row, and then if you go to start running across that row, the first number that you see is 0.1915, and that's 0.50 standard deviations away from the mean. Your next number is 0.1950, and on that you are 0.51 standard deviations away from the mean. And if you sort of head on all the way across to 0.55 standard deviations away from the mean, your value is 0.2088. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is the area that you see shaded under the normal distribution on this chart is to the right of the mean. But remember, because a normal distribution is perfectly symmetrical, it works also to the left of the mean. Okay, so just remember that while probabilities are never negative, because you can't have below a 0% probability, your Z values can be negative, and all a negative Z value indicates is that you are to the left of the mean. So if I wanted to know the area under the distribution minus 0.72 standard deviations away from the mean, in other words, 0.72 standard deviations to the left of the mean, the area under my distribution would be 0.2642, and my drawing would look a little bit different. I'd have my hashed area starting from the center of the distribution and going to the left of the center of the distribution. So hopefully that makes sense. So here is a typical PE style problem. The population mean for college students' height is 67 inches, and the population standard deviation is 4 inches. These data are normally distributed. What percent of college students have heights less than 71 inches? So I think the key to these things is being able to draw your normal distribution, figure out where you are along that distribution, and then use the Z equation to solve your problem. So if you kind of take a look at the answer, I know I don't draw perfectly symmetric normal distributions, but the drawing at the top is college students' heights. It's a population mean, so it's all of them. We're going to use the Z chart. And the mean is at the center of the distribution, and it's 67 inches. And the question asks you, what percentage of college students have heights of 71 inches and below? So your X value is 71, and it's greater than 67, so that's to the right of the mean. And you're going to use your Z equation. Z is X minus mu over sigma. So your X value is 71 inches. Mu is 67 inches, and your standard deviation is 4. So if you solve that equation, you get a Z value of 1. You need to find the area under the Z distribution where Z is 1. So if we sort of back up to our Z chart, and we go down at first column, and we go all the way down to 1.0, and we get 0.3413 is the area under our distribution where we are 1 standard deviation away from the mean. So we fill that in, and then if you want the entire probability that you're 71 inches or less, remember that 0.3413 area that we just read is always read from the center of the distribution to, in this case, 1 standard deviation to the right of the distribution. And so the area between the two lines on that that graph up there, that area is 0.3413. But don't forget, it's everyone up to 71 inches. So you have to add the other half of the normal distribution. We know because the normal distribution, the entire area under that curve is 1, representing 100% of the possibilities. From the center of the distribution to minus infinity, that entire area is half the distribution, or 0.5. So the probability is going to be 0.5, which represents the entire left half of the distribution, plus 0.3413, which represents the area from the center of the distribution to 1 standard deviation to the right of the mean, and the answer is 0.8413, or 84%. Okay, using the same set of data, in what range would you find the middle 70% of the data? So here you're going to pick the closest z-value, in other words, do not interpolate. And I'll give you a couple minutes to sort of think about this problem and start to try to set it up. Okay, so again, I think the key to these problems is being able to draw your normal distribution and really figure out kind of where you are and sort of what you're solving for. So in terms of the middle 70% of the data, you draw your normal distribution. I've got a line in the center that represents mu, the mean is 67 inches. You know that the middle 70% of the data have to, again, because it's a symmetrical distribution, you have to have an equal area to the right of the mean and an equal area to the left of the mean. And since it's the middle 70% and you split it exactly in two, the area to each side of the mean is 0.35. If you add 0.35 and 0.35, you come up with 0.7, and we have drawn the middle 70% of the data. And so what we are trying to solve for is a high value and a low value, and those are your x values. So you need to rearrange your z equation to solve for x. But notice we're actually using the z charts now in a slightly different way. So up to this point, we have solved for z and read a corresponding area under the distribution from the center of the distribution to z number of standard deviations away. In this particular case, we're starting with an area, and from that we need to back out a z value. So if we know the area is 0.35, I'm going to run back to the z chart real quick here. What you're now going to do is search all of these areas under the distribution until you get to the one that is the closest to 0.35. And remember, we said in the problem, don't interpolate, just choose the value that's the closest. And if you sort of run around and look at this data, all of these numbers and all these columns, you pretty quickly see that if you go to the 1.0 row and read across, that you've got 0.3485, and that's pretty close to 0.35. Next value to the right is 0.3508, which is even closer to 0.35 than 0.3485. So you're going to read that 0.3508 area under the distribution corresponds to a z value of 1.04. So my z value is 1.04. If I rearrange my equation to solve for x, my high value is going to be the mean 67 plus 1.04. I have a positive z value to the right of the mean, so it's plus 1.04 times the standard deviation of 4, and you get, I guess I don't know, whatever that is. And below, because you are to the left of the mean now, your z value is negative. And again, that just indicates that to the left of the mean. So the low value is 67 minus 1.04 times 4. And that's how you solve for those two ends of this, if you will, 70% confidence interval, which again we'll talk about in a little bit. So then there's one more, and again I'll give you all a minute to start setting this up. 90% of college students have heights greater than what value? Okay, again, a trick for this is just making sure that as you draw your normal distribution, you know where to sort of draw what it is that you're looking for. So if 90% of college students have a height greater than what value, again, for the population representing 100% of the possibilities of the area under the distribution, you are looking for an x value, a height, that 90% of the students are taller than. And so if you take a look at this drawing, and again, just a normal distribution with the mean at the center, which splits the distribution in two with 0.5% or 50% of the possibilities on each side of the distribution. 90% greater than what value means that you set your x value down there, sort of way off to the left of the mean, and since that entire area to the left of the distribution is 0.5, 90% is greater than what means that the area from the center of the distribution to that x value, that area under the distribution is 0.4. That is the place at which 90% of the students will have a higher height than whatever that x value is. So once again, you're going to need to use your normal distribution with an area given to back out a z value. So again, we can kind of go back to that again. And if you take a look, again, not interpolating, if we go to the 1.2, if you start with the z column and you go down to the 1.2 row and read across at 1.28, that's the value of z. The area under your distribution is 0.3997, which is the closest area that we have to 0.4000, and so our z value is 1.28. Because that x value is to the left of the mean, that means our z value is negative, and so we rearrange that z equation once again to solve for x, and we've got 67, the mean value, minus 1.28 times 4, and so you've got the solution to that. So that's just sort of a brief review of the normal distribution itself. So the thing is about engineers is that we almost never work with populations. I mean, if we've got a small population of something, then yes, we're going to use, we'll use population data, but often we use samples. And then we try to draw conclusions about a population based on a sample. So just remember, you've got two charts, typically when you're talking about sampling. You've got a Z chart, and that you use for large samples. So if you have greater than 30 points in your data set, and it's the number of points in your data set, if you're greater than 30, you're going to always use the Z chart. If you've got 30 or less points in your data set, you're going to use a T chart for small samples. And also, when you do sample, your statistical equation changes just a little bit to reflect the fact that you've got a sample. So if the Z equation we were just using for Z distribution with populations, if Z is X minus mu over sigma, when you're using samples, the equation you notice will look exactly the same. It's just you've got an X bar to say, that's your sample mean. And you actually add in a square root of n factor to account for the fact that you've got a sample with n data points in it. So just realize too that the equation on the right is the denominator is sigma standard deviation divided by the square root of n. So one of the ways that you might encounter sample type questions with statistics on a PE is with confidence intervals. These are used a lot in research and process control. 95% confidence intervals are really the most commonly used data points in this way, and so there might for example, to say what is the 95% confidence interval of a set of 50 data points. The mean of this data set is 50, and the standard deviation is 15. And so when you ask a question like this, when you solve for the answer, what you're essentially saying is that if a random number comes up from this data point, that you're 95% confident that it's going to land between a low value and a high value. That's dependent on that particular data set. So if you take a look at the three equations across the bottom of this slide, you're going to recognize the first one on the left, X is U plus or minus Z times sigma. That's just the Z equation rearranged for populations. The middle one is intended for large samples, and with again n, the number of data points in your data set is greater than 30. So notice it looks very similar to the population one, but you've got these slight differences in equations to reflect for the fact that you have a sample. You're going to see the Z value. You can see Z's got a subscript there that says alpha over 2. Okay, alpha is the area under your normal distribution that's not contained in your confidence interval. So if you've got a 95% confidence interval, that means there's a 5% chance that your data point's going to fall outside of it. Alpha, in that particular case, is 0.05. There's a divided by 2 factor there to reflect for the fact that, again, you've got normally distributed data where you're symmetric about the mean. And so you're going to take that entire alpha value, that 5% in the case of the 95% confidence interval, and you're going to split it in 2. So there's going to be a high point and a low point on your confidence interval, and you need to have an equivalent alpha value of 0.025 on each side of your mean. It'll make more sense when we do an example problem. If you take a look at the equation to the right, it's the same confidence interval equation, but it's for a small sample. So now instead of a mean of mu, it's X bar. Again, it's just sample mean. Instead of using a Z, you now have a T value. And the T, again, you need to get a T chart. If you don't have one already in your references, because again, those TE manuals only give you a T chart. You're going to need a T chart for the ag exam. As is the sample standard deviation, and again, for an event, that's just the square root of the number of points in your data set. So going back to the question we have here, what's the 95% confidence interval of a set of 50 data points? Mean of the data set is 150, standard deviation is 15. You know the equation to use because you take a look at what n is. N is 50. It's a sample, so you're not going to use the equation on the left. 50 is greater than 30. That's a large sample, so you're going to use the middle equation on the bottom there. And you were given the mean and the standard deviation and the number of data points in your sample. You just need to figure out what the Z value is, that Z subscript alpha over 2 value, and then you solve for your confidence interval, and those are going to be the high X value and the low X value, if you will. So again, just stating before, alpha is the area under the distribution that's not contained in the confidence interval. If it's a 95% confidence interval, that means that you've got 5% that's not contained. It's sort of like saying confidence interval is the middle 95% of your data point. And so you take that alpha value of 0.05, you split it in two, and you put the 0.025 on the outer end of your normal distribution. And you then have to back out a z-value given the area under your distribution. And remember, with z-distributions, you always read from the center of the distribution to z number of standard deviations away. And so if you know, again, that the entire half of a normal distribution, all of that adds up to 0.5 or 50% of the possibilities. If your outer tail there is 0.025, that means that the area from the center of the distribution to that alpha over 2 value is 0.475. So you just need to go back to your z-chart and find, which mine doesn't go that high, sorry. So get out your entire z-chart, and if you do, then you will figure out that when your area is 0.475, your z-value corresponding is 1.96. So then you just plug all your values into your confidence interval equation. Your high value is the mean, which in this case is 150 for this problem. Your z alpha over 2 value is 1.96. The sample standard deviation was 15. And you divide by the square root of 50, where 50 is the number of points in your data set. And you solve for the high. There's a negative value on the low just because, again, you've got a perfectly symmetrical distribution. And your z-value to the left of the mean is minus 1.96. And so that's the value you plug in, and you get the low value of your confidence interval. So you might get a hypothesis testing question as well. And what hypothesis testing does is it compares mean values to each other to determine if those values are significantly different. And so with hypothesis testing, there are different kinds of tests. And so when you get a problem like this, you just have to figure out what kind it is. So typically, you might get a sample mean, maybe that you did some experiments for, and it's either going to be a large sample or a small sample, and maybe you're comparing it to a standard value to determine maybe if a test that you've run is in compliance or not. You might also compare sample means to each other. So you might have a large sample compared to a small sample, a large sample to another large sample, small to small, small to large. Typically, if you've got sample means, I think for me, anytime I work with data, unless it's a standard value or an absolute value like a constant, I almost always think of whatever absolute values I've got in terms of numbers. I always think about the plus minus sign that comes after that, even if you don't always report it, meaning that, you know, there's variation included with all kinds of data. And so you need to just make sure if you're doing a hypothesis test, you're just trying to show that one mean is either different from another one, or maybe they're not statistically significantly different. So as you think about comparing means to each other or sample means to a standard, you just need to figure out if you're going to use a t-chart or a z-chart. Another thing you have to ask yourself is a test one-tailed or two-tailed? And what that means is you've got two means, and they're going to have magnitudes, and they're going to be different. So depending on how the question is asked, if you're asked, is this mean greater than that mean, or is this mean less than that mean, then directionality matters. It matters if one mean is greater than another or less than another. That is a one-tailed test. If the only concern is, are these two means different, then it's a two-tailed test. And the reason that matters is it actually impacts your alpha values, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, too. So steps for hypothesis testing, to do a test like this, we're trying to test two means to see if they're similar or different. You start by asking yourself, what am I trying to show? And that is your alternate hypothesis. The null hypothesis contains all the other possibilities. So again, between the two, you've got 100% of the possibilities contained. You're then going to construct your acceptance and rejection region for the hypothesis. And then you're going to calculate a test statistic, and you're going to essentially place that test statistic along your acceptance and rejection region, and you're going to determine, you're going to make a conclusion. And you always test the null hypothesis. So you're going to place that and place the test statistics in your acceptance and rejection region and determine whether you're going to accept or reject that null hypothesis. Apologies in advance, this isn't the best table copying style, but this is an example of a T-chart. And so if you take a look at this T-chart, the first column and the last column are the same. Usually instead of saying, I forgot the name of that Greek filter formula. They usually say DF for degrees of freedom. Eta, I don't know. Anyway, first and last column on this particular table are the same, just to make it easier for you to sort of follow across the row. But the degrees of freedom are something that you're going to have to put into play whenever you use a T-chart. So remember, you're going to use a T-chart when you have a small sample of 30 or fewer data points in your data set. The degrees of freedom of your sample is just n, the number of data points in your data set, minus 1. So if I have 12 data points in my sample, and I want to figure out the t-value where alpha is 0.025, I'm going to use degrees of freedom, 12 minus 1, I'm going to get to 11, and then I'm going to read across my 11th row to the column where t is 0.025 and my t-value is 2.201. So a t-chart looks somewhat similar to a normal distribution. The t-chart actually changes in shape according to the number of data points in your data sample. And once you get above 30, the shape of a t-chart, it actually approaches and then becomes a z-chart. So this is just one example of a t-chart and how it works. Make sure, again, that you get one for the exam. So here's an example in hypothesis testing. A biodiesel plant has a standard daily production rate that is normally distributed with a mean of 880 tons per day. Sampling the plant once a day for 35 days yielded a mean output of 870 tons per day, with a standard deviation of 20 tons per day. Do the data present sufficient evidence to show that the output is less than the standard? So, if we take our four-step process, the first thing we're going to do is construct an alternate and null hypothesis. So the problem statement asked us to show that the output is less than the standard. In other words, if you go back and read this again, do the data present sufficient evidence to show that the output is less than the standard? So your alternate hypothesis, which is indicated by capital HA, is that mu, the mean, is less than 880 tons per day. The null hypothesis is every other possibility. It's indicated by H naught, and that mu is greater than or equal to 880 tons per day. So if you take a look at the alternate hypothesis, you've got this less than sign there, so we can see that directionality matters, and that means it's a one-tailed test. If we were just trying to show that, again, that the two means are different, it would be a two-tailed test. Okay, so you've constructed the alternate and null hypothesis. Next thing we have to do is construct the acceptance and rejection region. So you start by drawing a standard that first sample is being compared to. And so to do this, you need to know four things. You need to know which side of the mean that your sample mean falls on compared to the standard that you're comparing to in this case, you need to know what alpha is. If it's not given, you assume that it's 0.05 because that's the standard value. You need to know whether you've done a one-tailed or a two-tailed test, and you need to know whether to use the T-chart or the Z-chart. So, those four things, the sample mean is 870, and that's less than our standard of 880. So that means we're gonna draw to the left of the mean in this case. Alpha was not given to you, so you assume it's 0.05. Directionality matters. You just look at the way that your alternate hypothesis is constructed, and its mean is less than 880, so it's a one-tailed test. And if you notice that it says that you had a mean daily output for 35 days, so that's the number of data points in your data sample. 35 is greater than 30, so you're going to use the Z-chart. So if you take those four pieces of information and you draw your normal distribution, and U is the standard, which is 880 tons per day, located at the center of the distribution. You know that whatever you're setting down is going to the left of the mean because your mean is less than 880. You know that alpha is 0.05. And all of alpha is going in one spot because it's a one-tailed test, and you're going to use the Z-chart to construct your critical point. So, with all that information, you can draw down that thick black line to the left of the mean. That is the critical point where the tail, that area from that point to minus infinity essentially is alpha is 0.05. The whole value is there. You're going to use the Z-chart. And again, because you know that you always read areas from the center of the distribution to the number of standard deviations away, the entire half of that Z-chart is 0.5 or 50% of the possibilities. You know that alpha is all in one spot and it's 0.05, so that means that the area from the center of the distribution to that critical Z value, that area is 0.45. If you use the Z-chart and go find the Z value where the area is 0.45, you get 1.645 standard deviations away from the mean. That Z value is negative because we are to the left of the mean. So when you slap down that thick black line there, that is your critical value. If you look at all the areas where alpha is, those are all the places that you are going to reject the null hypothesis. So if you notice there's an arrow that's emanating out to the left from that thick black line where it says H naught, the null hypothesis is rejected. To the right, that's where your null hypothesis is accepted. So you have essentially constructed the acceptance and rejection region now for this particular hypothesis test question, and now you have to calculate the test statistic. And so you know that test statistic, Z-calc or Z-test, is equal to the mean of your data set minus mu, which is the mean of the standard in this case, divided by sigma over the square root of n. All those values are given to you, and so when you calculate that test statistic, your Z-calc is minus 2.95. What you then have to do is place that on your test. So if you know that your critical value is minus 1.645, minus 2.95 is far off to the left of minus 1.645, which means that you are far into the rejection region. You're going to reject the null and conclude that the alternate is true. So your critical value is minus 1.645. Your calculated value is minus 2.95. If you actually draw that Z-calc into the acceptance and rejection region, again, it falls into the portion of the curve in which the null is rejected. So you will reject the null and conclude that the alternative hypothesis is true. Yes, sufficient evidence exists for showing that the mean output of the plant is less than 880 tons per day. And so if you just want the sort of drawing of that, with a critical value of minus 1.645. Your Z-calc out there is minus 2.95. You're far into the rejected null area. And that is an example of a hypothesis test. So, in terms of a statistics summary, general tips are going to be, just make sure you've got references with these tables in them. You need to get a hold of a T-chart. Just remember, you've got simple equations to use for this. You need to know how to get a z-value from the area under the distribution, and also an area under the distribution given a z-value. You should know confidence intervals. Sometimes I'm amazed that you might encounter problems on the exam that say, what's the 2 sigma limit in process control if the mean is a given value and the standard deviation is a given value, and all you're doing there is just saying the mean plus or minus 2 times the standard deviation, the mean plus or minus 3 times the standard deviation. That's all a 2 and 3 sigma limit is, sigma being the standard deviation. So you might get a process control problem like that and have the simplest equation possible. Not even a sample, just what's the 2 sigma control limits. If the mean is 10 and the standard deviation is 1. And so it would be, 2 times 1 plus 10 and 2 times 1 minus 10. They can be that simple. In terms of the hypothesis testing, it is a really step-by-step cookbook approach. When you do draw that acceptance and rejection region, you want to draw the mean that you're comparing to, or the standard that you're comparing to, first. And then you're essentially putting you're really overlaying one mean, which comes with a standard deviation, over another mean that has a standard deviation. You're trying to see if those are sufficiently similar to each other, that they're statistically the same mean-wise, or if they're different. Do remember, too, with hypothesis testing, when you compare 2 small samples, you can just pick one and then slap the other one on top of it, if you will. And you just need to keep your means properly situated so that your z-values are negative and positive as they should be. And just remember, too, if you've got 2 small samples, each one has its individual degrees of freedom, and so you actually have to pool or add the samples together. So if you've got 2 small samples, you take the number of data points in the first sample, the number of data points in the second sample, and subtract 2. And then just remember, you always test the null hypothesis, which leads to a conclusion about the alternate. I do have a couple of questions for you to kind of, samples to run at the end. And I think one is a hypothesis test that involves 2 small samples, so you can see how those work. So switching gears now into our third spot of engineering economic analysis. These really are pretty beginning questions if you know how to use the factor tables, also known as the interest tables. So they are tabulated in those large PE reference manuals for mechanical and civil engineering. And you can use those to quickly do problems like decision making. You might be given 2 choices and you're trying to decide which one's most economical given things like present cost, future value, maintenance cost, etc. You might do a replacement or retirement analysis, a rate of return problem, where is the break-even point, how long does it take to repay a loan, how much is it, over how much time, life cycle costs, or benefit cost analysis. So engineering econ is again, these are quick and easy problems on the PE exam. So almost all engineering and economic problems involve cash flows. So that really is just like a material balance. It just uses money instead of math. And so there are 4 kinds of cash flows. There's a single payment cash flow. So P, capital P, just represents the present value of your money. S is the future value of your money. There's then a uniform series cash flow indicated by a capital A, and that's going to be the amount that's the same every month, for example, a house payment or a car payment. And then there's a gradient series cash flow, which is really, you don't encounter too much, but that's indicated with a capital G, And that's some sort of value that's going to go up or down the same amount during every episodic time period you have in a problem like this. So you can use these types of cash flows to compare alternatives and solve engineering economic problems. You just have to make sure that you are comparing apples to apples. Apologies again for not the best reproducible issue, but this table is taken from a PE manual, and your cash flows, you can calculate them using the equation. So you can kind of see the equations. They all have factor names. I remember none of them, but they tell you how to convert, for example, net first row present value to future value. There's a symbol that goes with that, and then there's a formula for determining how to move from a present value to a future value. So you can use the equations, but the data are tabulated, and that is much quicker. So just as an example, if you wanted to, for example, use an equation, and you get a question like, if you put $1,000 into a savings account and the annual interest rate on the account 6%, how much money would be in the account after 5 years? So the equation you can see from the previous slide that's going to convert the present value to a future value is the future value is equal to the present value times this factor, 1 plus I to the nth power, where I is the interest rate, and in this case, n is the number of time periods, number of points, the time period in your particular situation. So again, you can see converting P to F, looking at that first row, the future value equals the present value times that single payment compound amount of 1 plus the interest rate, all to the nth power. So that 1 plus I to the nth power is called single payment compound amount factor, and it is tabulated for various combinations of interest rate and n. And again, in this case, n just means the time period. So that notation, and you can see it in that table, was F over P, comma I percent, comma n. So that notation just indicates that the future amount, the future dollar amount, is unknown, that you have the present value amount, and given the interest rate in percent and the time period, n, you can find the future value. So if you were to do this with a calculator, you just solve it by the equation, where the future value is equal to the present value of $1,000, times that factor of 1 plus the interest rate, 0.06%, and that is an annual interest rate, and you raise that to the time period, which is 5 years, so it's to the 6th power, and you get $1,338.23. So you can use those equations, but it's much quicker to use the interest tables. So in our particular case, you would go to the interest table where I is 6%, and you are going to go to the F over P column, okay, and then you're going to, and again, all of these different columns represent how to convert from one of these cash flow factors to another. So if you want F, you have P, so you're going to go to the F over P column towards the middle of your table, and then you're going to run down. If you notice, the first column and the last column are both N, and they're the same, which just makes it easier to read from one end of the table or the other. And you're going to go down that N column to 5, because N is 5 in this case. Your time period is 5 years. And so if you go down the first column of N all the way to 5, and then you read across the 5 row to the F over P factor, you can see it's 1.3382. So again, you go to that F over P column, and it's 5 with a 6% table, and your factor is 1.3382. And so if you just multiply $1,000 times 1.3382, you get $1,338.20, which is just essentially the same thing as $1,338.23 that you got by using the equation. So the biggest thing to keep in mind with these is you want to make sure that your units match. In other words, your interest rate, it has to match your time period. So if N is in years, you want your interest rate to be annual. If N is in months, then your interest rate needs to be at the monthly interest rate so that you keep your time units the same. So why don't y'all try this one? How much should you put into a 10% effective annual rate savings account in order to have $10,000 in 4 years? So I'm going to have you all try this one. I've got part of a 10% interest table included on the next page. So looks like you're given a future value and a time period, and you've got an interest rate given, and you need to know how much to put into that account now, so that's a present value. So here's your factor table at 10%. I'll give you a few seconds on this one. Okay, so remember, you're given a future amount of money, that's $10,000, and you're asked to solve for the present amount of money that you need to put into a savings account at a 10% interest rate. So you've got your 10% interest rate table, and you're going to solve using this table with N is 4. So again, you would read either down the first column or the last column, which are identical, just to facilitate easy reading. So you're going to use the N equals 4 row. And because you are solving for the present value, in this notation, remember in this case, what you're solving for, the P is going to come first. So you're going for the P over S column at the 10% interest table with N is 4. And so if you take a look at that P over F column with N is 4, you get 0.6830. So sort of switching over. We're here at the middle of the slide now where we just read our value. And so your present value is equal to your future value times that factor. And if you sort of write in the factor that you have there, you can even sort of see how algebraically this works out, right? Present value is the future value times, look at that first part of this factor, P over F, F times P over F, works out to a present value. So again, it's a 10% interest rate, 4 years. That's $10,000 times your factor, 0.6830, and that means that you need to put $6,830 into a 10% annual interest rate account in order to have $10,000 4 years from now. My God, I wish that there were such a thing as a 10% interest rate savings account. I would use one. Anyway, you do want to notice for this particular equation that N is given in years and the interest rate is given as an annual interest rate, so the units match. So here's another one. Maintenance costs for a machine are $250 a year. What is the present worth of these maintenance costs over a 12-year period if the annual interest rate is 10%? So again, what you're given is maintenance costs per year. It's a recurring amount. So that's the capital A factor, and you're being asked what the present worth is, and that is the P factor. And so you've got the recurring interest rate of A, not the interest rate, the recurring amount, A, $250. You need the present value. You're going to use that 10% interest chart and go to the P over A column. And so if we run back here real quick, and go to the P over A column. You can see the third one overall in the chart. And you go down to 12 years and read that P over A column, you get 6.8137. And so you solve then for present value. And there's a negative sign in front of 250 because that is a cost. And so the negative sign, once you multiply by the factor, represents that's what it's going to cost you over a 12-year period to do maintenance costs on this particular machine. So here's a more complicated one. I did not see anything even close to this on the PE exam when I took it. The first three problems were really a whole lot more like it. But this is an example. As a manager of a large fleet of farm equipment, you're contracting with an outside mechanic shop to have all complete engine overhauls for tractors, combines, and harvesters at the rate of $7,200 per engine. You've determined that the investment needed to construct a new building and equip it to overhaul the equipment yourself would be $180,000. The estimated annual cost for taxes and insurance for the facilities and equipment is 1.25% of the purchase price. The operating cost to perform engine overhauls at the facility that you would own would be $5,500 per engine. The equipment and facilities are assumed to have a life of 12 years with a salvage value of $35,000. Interest rate is 7% per year. The minimum number of engines to be overhauled per year to make the investment in equipment and facilities economically feasible is. So you would use the 7% interest table. I don't think I have that on here, but you can go back and check because the 7% interest table is in those reference manuals, and make sure that these numbers are that you can find these numbers correctly. So your approach here is you've got a decision to make using engineering economic analysis. So you're comparing two alternatives, outsourcing versus doing it yourself. To outsource it, it's $7,200 per engine. If you're going to do it yourself, it's only $5,500 per engine, but you also have to take into consideration facilities, equipment, taxes, and insurance. And then you've got that salvage value as well. You're going to get something out of it at the end. So you need to choose a basis in terms of cash flows of how to compare one alternative to another. So in this particular case, because so many of these values are given a kind of a per year basis, and you've got this per engine basis, you're going to choose that recurring factor of A, and you want to identify which type of cash flow that you have, and you're going to set the outsourcing and insourcing terms equal to each other because you're solving for X, where X is the number of engines that you need to break even. So if you outsource at $7,200 per engine times X in engines, your outsourcing term is 7,200X. For insourcing, you've got a number of terms. To do it yourself, it's $5,500 per engine times X in engines, or 5,500X. The new building and equipment is going to cost you $180,000 right now. That's a present value. You're going to need to convert that to A. The interest is 1.25% of your building and equipment per year, which is already given in that A factor. You just multiply it times the total amount that's due right now is the building, so you get $2,250. And then your salvage value is $35,000 12 years from now. So for future value, you need to convert it to an A. So you're going to use the equation or the interest tables. And the interest tables are way easier than the equations. So if you look at the in-source terms, you've got your new buildings and equipment, you've got your present value of $180,000, your annualized cash flow factor with the 7% interest table and it's 12. That factor turns out to be 0.1259, and so the annualized value of the new building and equipment is $22,662. Your salvage value is future value of $35,000. You need to convert that to your A, your annualized factor, using the A over F 7% and it's 12 calculation. So from, again, using that 7% interest table, you're going to read a value of 0.0559. So that's 1,957. And then you're going to set your insourcing terms equal to your outsourcing terms. So for insourcing, $5,500 per engine, 5,500x, plus the 22,662, which is your annualized value for the new building and equipment, plus your interest, which was the 1.25% of your current equipment and building, and that's 2,250. And then you're going to include the salvage value that you'll get. And in this particular case, it's going to come out as a negative sign because you are constructing this particular problem on a cost basis. And so if we're talking about how much it costs, the salvage value means you get money back. So that is a negative as a result. So just algebraically, you wind up with that equation right before the bottom line, 22,955 is 1,700x, and you solve and get x is 13.5. And again, because you can't overhaul half an engine, you're going to round up to the nearest integer, which is 14 engines. If you did a problem like this on the PE exam, you probably would get the possible answers to choose of 13 and 14. Just to keep in mind that even if you do all of this correct, that you would know that you can't overhaul half an engine, you've got to round up. So, a summary of engineering economic analysis. Really, this is also a step-by-step cookbook approach, just like statistics. You really just have to identify which factors you're working with and ensure that you're using the same basis of time with respect to interest rate and your time period. Use the interest tables because I feel like those really quickly help you solve any engineering economic tables, and so you want to make sure you've got a set for your PE exam. So, again, if your brain feels like it's leaking out of your ears, please don't worry. I felt like that at the end of every single PE session that I attended online, and I don't know, it just took a little bit of time to sort of absorb everything, but I practiced, and the exam was a whole lot easier having gone through this webinar process. I can tell you the best things I did for the PE is to have at least one reference book with a fantastic index, a list of where to find your critical equations and important information, execute those time management tips, and very much good luck. And just remember, again, if you don't pass the exam, there is no shame in flunking this exam. It's hard. It's a hard test to pass, but you can do it if you just take the time to study and just keep at it and manage your time well in the exam and bring in great references. So again, if I can answer any questions, please shoot me an email. Again, it's on the first slide, but it's emily1@lsu.edu, and really that concludes my presentation. I do have a couple of these hypothesis testing problems, and I will post the solutions to these in a separate file along with those short answer where to look up things. So with that, I will sign off from here, and again, good luck.